The sky changes through the year and the constellations shift and we get new ones in different seasons, but there are different ways to look at them. So I'm going to concentrate on what, when I first learned them many, many years ago, we learned this thing in the winter called the winter circle, which is this circle of very bright stars you see right around here. So we're going to concentrate on this part of the sky largely tonight. We might take a couple looks off to the side, but we're going to concentrate on that. Into the winter circle, we do have one planet that's really, really prominent here at 8 o'clock tonight. If you get out early, you can still see Saturn, but by 8 now, Saturn's gone. It's set below the horizon. But you see this really bright one off to the southwest. That's the planet Jupiter. And it'll, when you go outdoors, if you get outside, maybe not tonight or maybe tonight, I don't know what the weather is where you are. But the southwest, you're going to see a very bright star, look like the brightest star up there, and that is the planet Jupiter. So let's take a quick look at Jupiter. We'll zoom in on it here. And if you have a pair of binoculars and look at Jupiter, you'll see the planet as a little tiny disk, and you'll see four little dots beside it. Now, with this program, this is a program called Stellarium, which I like a lot, but it does have a couple drawbacks. And one of them is at this scale, these dots you see here to the left of Jupiter, these three here and this one, those are the four Galilean moons. They can be here tonight. They're all on the left side or the east side. The other night there were two over here on the right and one on the left and one behind Jupiter. So they move back and forth and right on one side. And the downside of this program is they look like they're big as Jupiter. And when you look at them through a pair of binoculars, if you can steady yourself, you can just barely see them. With the telescope, they're going to look like stars, more like this star right here next to Jupiter, just little dots, but they'll be lined right up. Now, as we get in a little closer, they drop down a little bit in their size compared to Jupiter, but they're still looking bigger than they're going to look in a telescope. When you look at Jupiter, you have to remember this planet is 1,000 times larger than the Earth in volume. It's a huge planet, biggest planet in the solar system, bigger than all the other planets put together. So it's huge. Not like Mars or Earth or Venus. There's no ground here. You can't land on it. It's made of clouds and gases and liquids inside. And the wind blows through these clouds at around 100 miles an hour. And what you'll notice, these two look like brown bands here or rusty colored bands. When you look at it live through telescope, they're just going to look gray. That color is not going to show up unless you take a photograph of it. With our eyes, with things of this brightness, you're going to just see mainly what would look like a black. But you will see those two bands pretty clearly if you get a clear sky, which if the weather holds, you have in the Rangeley region. And you'll see these four moons. Now, Jupiter actually has 96 moons going around it that we know of. That's a lot of moons. But it has four big moons and 92 littles. And with the backyard telescope, you're only going to see the four big ones. You see Io, Europa, Ganymede, this one here, and Callisto. And those are the four moons. And usually they look like in a straight line. It's kind of an interesting formation to get this little triangle out of them because usually they're lined right up in a straight line. Very often a couple on one side and a couple on the other, or three in one. And as I say, they move back and forth from night to night. So tonight, if you could go out right now, you'd see this interesting little triangle, and you don't get to see that formation very often. So I find that kind of fascinating. Let's zoom back now. So you should definitely check out Jupiter. It's very bright, very beautiful to look at, and really interesting, some neat things to see with a pair of binoculars, and even better with a small scope. Now look over a little to the east of south, and you're going to see this circle of bright stars. We'll start with Sirius. That's the brightest star in the night sky. The only thing you're going to see outside tonight brighter will be Jupiter. But remember, Jupiter is a planet. It's not a star. You go from Sirius to Procyon, to Pollux and Castor, up to Capella, down to Aldebaran, down to Rigel, and back to Sirius. When I first learned the stars, I learned them in the wintertime, and so we concentrate on the sky. And this circle of stars we call the winter circle. Sometimes it's called the winter hexagon. Sometimes it's called the winter G. You start here and you go up around this way around the circle, and then you get to and you come in Betelgeuse right here, which is equally bright, and it's kind of inside the circle. So there are ways you can look at this. I kind of like the winter G. That's kind of cool too. Now, that's not a constellation. It's what we call an asterism, which is a group of stars that kind of stand out and they're in the course of this winter circle, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 constellations. And the most famous one is the one right here in the center called Orion the Hunter. To see Orion, we have 3 stars in a row for Orion's belt going around his waist. That's the famous part. He has a leg down to Rigel, which is one of the stars in our winter circle, and a leg down to a star named Saiph. And his belt's pulled down a little to one side because of this sword hanging from his belt right here. Above his belt, we come up to Betelgeuse and over to Bellatrix and back down to his belt, and that marks his torso or his body, with Betelgeuse and Bellatrix as his shoulders. We back off just a little bit so we can see his arms here. This little triangle of stars above his shoulders marks his head. He has an arm raised up in the air like this with a club in his hand. It's drawn in different ways in different programs. Come back down his arm and across his shoulder. His other arm comes down like this, and this curve of stars is his shield. Now, I can draw some lines on here for you, which might help you see them better. Let me connect the stars right there. We go. And I draw it a little differently. Some of you may have heard me say, you have 3 or 4 different apps, you look up Orion on them all. They'll all use the same basic stars, but they connect the dots differently. Officially speaking, Orion is everything inside this red polygon. You can connect the dots any way you want to make the picture. Sometimes you make a picture that's not even what it's supposed to be of. This makes a pretty good dot to dot man. So I usually stick with Orion, but there are some others that, like the Big Dipper, it's actually supposed to be a bear, but it looks more like a dipper. So we draw it that way. It doesn't make you a bad astronomer. It's about knowing where it is in the sky. So here's Orion the Hunter. Now, you can also, if you find some books, rather than having lines like this, they'll have nice fancy pictures. And those are beautiful, though I find they're not always helpful if you want to go outside and find the constellations yourself. It's hard to look at that picture and look up in the sky and envision that in the stars. Whereas for me, I can draw those dot to dot lines and look up and kind of connect the dots myself. So Orion's standing up there, and he's pretty standard and easy to find because those 3 stars for his belt and that hourglass shaped body here. Now he is fighting with someone. You see he's got his shield up and his club raised like he's ready to clobber someone. He's fighting with Taurus the bull. To find Taurus, you draw a line up through his belt to the bright orangish star named Aldebaran. Aldebaran marks the eye of the bull. This V shape right here, let's go in a little closer so you can see the bull better. This is his eye. This V is his face. Now, kids always want him to have 2 eyes. Why doesn't the bull have 2 eyes? Well, so this is one eye, and this is the other eye. And one's brighter because he's been fighting and maybe he has a black eye. Use your imagination a little bit. You kind of have to with these things. So above his face here, this V is the Hyades, which is an open cluster of stars, which means they're all young stars, except for Aldebaran, which is technically not part of the group. It's only half the distance away than the rest of the stars. And it's the closest open cluster of young stars to us. And it marks the face of the bull. Now, the bull has 2 horns, a big horn right there and another horn right there. The back of his head and neck come down, and then his back goes over to this little cluster of stars called the Pleiades, another open cluster of stars, young stars. Now, when I say young, the Pleiades are 70 million years old, and that sounds pretty old to most people. But for stars that can last for billions of years, being 70 million years old is kind of like being in 6th or 7th grade. They're like, teenagers, young teenagers hanging out with each other. And they're kind of like siblings because they all form from the same cluster, cloud of gas in space. So that's another open cluster of young stars. That's in the bull's back. The bull's belly comes up here, this line of stars, with a front leg here and a front leg down here. Now, they don't draw the bull quite the way I do. They don't give him all the lines. They give him his 2 nice horns there and his face and his back. So I make the back come up like this and give him a hump here. And they don't give him a belly. I wish they'd do that. And I would always give him a second front leg here because there's stars for that. That's the way I draw it. They draw it a little differently. But you get the idea. Orion is fighting the bull is charging at Orion, and the 7 sisters are riding on the bull's back. Now, Orion's not fighting this bull alone. He has his 2 best friends beside him, 2 dogs, Canis Major and Canis Minor, which means the big dog and the little dog. To find the big dog, go back to Orion. Remember how we went up through his belt to find Aldebaran and the face of the bull? Go down through his belt the other way, and it points you to the bright star Sirius. Sirius is the brightest star in the entire night sky, and it marks, I draw it as the nose of the dog, though this program draws it as a shiny stone he has on his collar. They draw him like this. This is his collar. This triangle is his head with a nose out here, a body and front legs and back legs and a tail. Now, the way I draw it pretty much the same, except I just say this is his nose and this is an ear, and I make a triangle here. And I call that his head, like he's looking right at you. You can do it any way you want. That's Canis Major, the big dog. But I said he had two dogs. Canis Minor is a little more challenging. If you have a hard time with these, just hold your breath on this one. Go from Sirius, go up past his nose to the next bright star, which would be Procyon. And I draw Procyon as the puppy dog's nose. So far, so good. From his nose, you draw a straight line back to Gametia, and that's his tail. And that's all there is to the little dog, just those two stars. So most people agree that doesn't look much like a dog. So the kids call it the hot dog because it's a little straight line. Not all constellations look as good as others. This one makes a pretty good dot-to-dot dog. At least to me it does. And Orion makes a pretty good man, and I can even see a bull here, but this one takes a little imagination. So we've covered half of our circle, a little more than half. We've got Rigel and Sirius and Procyon. From there, we come up to Pollux and Castor. They're the Gemini twins. And this constellation looks like two stick people, two twin brothers, Pollux and Castor. And we'll just put lines up there, and you can kind of see those two stick people standing there pretty clearly. They're obviously not identical twins, but they stand there above Orion on the faint band of light you can barely see through here, which is the Milky Way. So we're almost done our winter circle. We come back to one of the brightest stars in the winter circle, and that's Capella right here. And Capella is in the constellation of Auriga, the charioteer. And Auriga, well, let me just put the lines on for you. Doesn't that look like a guy driving a chariot? This pentagon of the stars? Well, that's Auriga. And the way I learned it was that this is his chariot here, and this is the guy's head up here. So the chariot, like Ben-Hur, wheel here, you use your imagination. Horses, who knows where the horse is? And that's the guy's head. But it's more complicated than that, because this charioteer is not just driving his chariot, he's carrying a goat. And Capella means the she-goat, so that's his goat. And these three stars here are known as the kids, the baby goats. So you've got a guy driving a chariot, lugging a goat with three baby goats. The ancients clearly didn't have video games to keep them busy, did they? They had a great imagination to see something like that in the sky. But it's an easy constellation to find. It's above Orion. It makes a nice pentagram up here in the sky with bright Capella, and the three kids stand out pretty clearly for you to see. Now we can put nice fancy pictures of them all up there if you like. See, they don't even draw the chariot there, but he is supposed to be a chariot driver. And I'm not sure exactly how you get that picture from that pentagram, but that's the way it goes. But we got a nice winter circle of stars and constellations here. Now there's some interesting things to find if you've got a pair of binoculars or a small telescope in this part of the sky, and I'd like to explore that just a little bit with you. So let's shut off all the lines, and let's come back to just Orion to start with here. Let's zoom in on Orion. If you've got a pair of binoculars, the first thing I'd like you to look for is find Orion's belt, go down and see his sword. They don't draw the line here for the sword like I do, but those three stars at the bottom that mark his sword, if you zoom in on them with your binoculars, you can see it looks kind of fuzzy, like there's a cloud or something there. Well, it turns out there is a cloud, and it'll look kind of like this with your binoculars, just a fuzzy patch of light. With a bigger telescope, it might look like this. Now, with the backyard telescope, you'll start to see all this detail of these clouds, but you won't see the color. If you take a photograph through the same telescope, that red will show up and the blue around the edges will show up, and you'll see all kinds of beautiful color. The part of our eyes that sees faint light turns out to be colorblind. It needs a lot of intense light for our cones in our eyes to actually pick up the color. So to our eyes at the eyepiece, it's all going to look like grayscale, like a black and white picture. You'll see all this detail, all these little fine lines will show up, but you won't see that color, even though it really is there. So what is this? This is what we call a nebula, and it's a giant cloud of hydrogen gas. It's 40 light years across from one side to the other. Now, a light year is not a length of time. Sounds like it. It's a distance. Like an inch is a little distance, a mile is a bigger distance. Well, a light year is a huge distance. It's the distance a beam of light will travel in a year's time. So light travels at the speed of 186,000 miles per second. At that speed, you could go all the way around the Earth 7.5 times in 1 second. That's pretty fast. If you go at that speed in a straight line for 1 year, you're going to cover some miles, right? That distance would be 1 light year. So this from here to here is 40 light years across. It's absolutely huge, but it's shrinking. Gravity is pulling the gas together and it's clumping together. And down here, it's really bright in the center. Young stars are forming. There's enough hydrogen in this cloud, and hydrogen, by the way, is what stars are made of. There's to make maybe 400 or 500 stars like our sun. So this is a place where stars are being born. And if you had a telescope, when this program won't show it, you'll see this won't all just look white like this. You'll actually see some individual stars in there, some very young stars, some only 1 million years old, which is like a baby star, maybe a toddler at most. And slowly, this whole thing's going to disappear and will be replaced by a whole bunch of young stars. Now, I've already mentioned that there are places where you see young stars, like the Hyades up here in Taurus the Bull. Remember them? That's an open cluster of stars right there, the closest one to the Earth. But the one that's really pretty to look at with your binoculars, and this is pretty to look at with the binoculars, if we zoom in on the Hyades, just for the sake of it, you get a better sense that it is a cluster of stars. Now, remember, the brightest one, Aldebaran, is not part of the cluster. Aldebaran is only 65 light years away, while the main cluster, all the other stars, are about 150 light years away. So this is just kind of photobombing the scene, so to speak. But it makes a nice addition because of that color. The one that I find most beautiful, though, is its neighbor. A little bit further away, the Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters. They are 440 light years away, almost 4 times further away than the Hyades. And these stars are around 70 million years old. Now, if you look at them with your binoculars, they're going to look kind of like this. You'll see it looks like a little pile of diamonds. They're actually going to be sparklier than they look here, because they won't look like round dots. They're going to look like pinpoints, bright pinpoints of varying brightness. If you take a photograph of them, then you start to see some nebulosity. And for a long time, it was thought this was what was left of the nebula they formed from. But recent studies have shown that most of that nebulosity is not really associated with the stars. It's between us and the stars, and the starlight shining through it and lighting it up. But it's not mixed in with the stars, even though it kind of looks that way. And we can tell that distance by studying the spectrum of the stars. So, but it's a beautiful, beautiful sight. It's beautiful when you take a picture, but it's pretty just with your eyes too. So if you'd been around 100 million years ago and you looked at this spot in the sky, none of those stars would have been there. What would have been in their place is a nebula, just like the Orion Nebula. And the same thing's true of the Hyades. The Hyades wouldn't have been there, but they are 625 million years old. So they're an older cluster. That's why they're dispersed, because over time, these clusters spread out and disperse into space. They don't stay together forever. So this is an older cluster, and that's why it's dispersed more. So those are two pretty interesting things to see in the sky. Now, come down to Sirius here. And Sirius, I told you, was the brightest star. And it's the brightest star you and I can see with our eyes. But I want you to do a thought experiment with me for a moment. Imagine you had a bumblebee that could talk. I know that sounds really outrageous, but imagine you had a bumblebee that could talk, and you and the bumblebee like to go stargazing together. And you go out some night and you're looking at Sirius, and you said to your friend, the bumblebee, look at Sirius. Isn't it beautiful tonight? It's the brightest star in the sky. And the bumblebee would turn and look at you and say, are you crazy? Look at Adhara, this star right here. That's the brightest star in the sky. It's way brighter than Sirius. Doesn't look it to me, but it would to a bumblebee. You see, bumblebees can see in ultraviolet light, and we can't. We don't see ultraviolet light, even though it's a type of light. Our eyes aren't tuned into it. And if you could see an ultraviolet light as well as visible light, Adhara would be way brighter than Sirius. Now, it is 3,700 times brighter than our sun. It's a very bright star. I mean, the Sirius is 25 times brighter than our sun, but this is way, way brighter. And if you could see the spectrum beyond visible light to include ultraviolet light, this would clearly be the brightest star in the sky. It's much more powerful than Sirius, but it is so powerful it gives most of its energy off in ultraviolet light, which is a higher energy light than visible light. We can't see that, but bumblebees and many insects can. So the way we view the sky and the way we view the world can be very different than it might be if you're an insect. I just think that's an interesting thing to notice. So that's an interesting part about the big dog here. Now, let's look up here to the Gemini twins. And just to the east of the Gemini twins is a very faint constellation called Cancer the Crab. And Cancer is right here. Let's put him up there. We see Orion and the dogs. Yeah, there's the little dog. We'll put that on there too. And here are the Gemini twins, Castor and Pollux. So just to the left of them, we see Cancer the crab. Now, if you've ever been to the coast and caught crabs in the seaweed, you know crabs don't have four legs. They actually have eight legs and two claws. In mythology, Hera sent the crab to distract Hercules when he was fighting the Hydra. And Hercules gave that crab a swift kick, and the crab went flying and lost a leg here and lost a leg there. And so he lost half of his leg. So in the sky, he's only pictured with the four legs. And very often you'll see this little square drawn as the crab's body and the legs coming off any way you'd like to have them from that body. But he does not have all of his legs. Now, what is appropriate for that crab? We take the lines away. You notice there are no bright stars in the crab. And that's, people who have Cancer as a zodiacal sign, people say, where's, they see Gemini. They go, oh, that's really cool. Looks just like Gemini. Or they see Leo, and Leo looks just like a lion. And the crab, like, oh, that's kind of sad. There are no bright stars. But you think about it, crabs hide. They don't sit out in the open because things come and eat them, like seagulls and things. So they want to hide. They don't want to stand up to be seen. And the crab kind of hides in the night sky. So you got to know where to look. So all you got to do is find the Gemini twins and draw a line from Castor to Pollux. And just off to the left of them, you're going to see that little square. Now, if you have binoculars, you want to look right in the center of that square, right in there, because you're going to see another one of those open clusters. This one is one of my favorites. It's called the Beehive cluster. And this one's 577 light years away, and it's a little bit older. It's about 700 million years old. So, it's older than the Pleiades. There are more stars here than the Pleiades. I think there's like almost 1,000 stars in this group altogether. And it's just a delightful little group of stars to be seen. Now, it's also called, it goes by number of names. The most common name you'll find today is the Beehive cluster. I guess someone thought perhaps it looked like a hive of bees because there are so many stars all zooming around in there. Let's brighten it up just a little bit here. As you get in closer, you see more and more of those stars. It's also known as Precipice, which means the manger. And the manger, when we think about it in the Christmas story, but a manger was a place where animals were kept. And these two stars, this one's name is Acela Borealis and Acela Australis. And Acela means the donkey. And so these are two donkeys at the manger feeding on the hay. So this was considered to be a pile of hay with two donkeys standing nearby feeding in the manger. So I kind of like that story too. So you can look at it in many different ways. The Chinese referred to this as a pile of the exhalation of piled up corpses, a little more gruesome way to think about it. So different cultures did look at the same group of stars and saw many different things. Now I want to go back to Orion one more time. Speaking of interesting things that are a little harder to see. Now the Beehive is easy to find, and Orion Nebula is easy to find, and the Hyades and the Pleiades are easy to find. Now I want to show you something really hard to find, but it's very famous. And it's very easy to look at the right spot. Go to Orion's belt and go to the left-hand or easternmost star. That's a star called Alnitak. And right underneath Alnitak is a very famous nebula called the Horsehead Nebula. Now, if you look at it with just your eyes through a pair of binoculars or a telescope, it's right here. Do you see it? I hope not. I can't see it either. And you probably won't see it. I've actually never laid my eyes directly on the Horsehead Nebula, but I've taken pictures of it, and it's easy to take a picture of. That's that star in Orion's belt. Take a photograph, and suddenly, voila, there it is. It's very, very faint and too faint to show up in to your eyes in most backyard telescopes. Unless you have a really large telescope, then you'll start to see it. And just like the Orion Nebula, you won't see the color, you'll see the forms. This is the part that makes the shape of the horse's head right here. And so what we have here is this red is hydrogen gas, just like the Orion Nebula. It's actually about the same distance away, and it may actually be part of the greater Orion Nebula, believe it or not, because it covers almost all of the constellation of Orion. There are just knots where it gets denser. The Horsehead is what's called an absorption nebula. Absorption nebula is a cloud of dust and gas that absorbs the light coming from behind it. So the red, when you see the red light, when you take a picture, it looks red. That's what's known as an emission nebula. That's a nebula that's emitting light. The hydrogen is getting enough energy from nearby young stars, and young stars give off lots of ultraviolet light, like we talked about with Alhara. And the ultraviolet light excites the molecules of hydrogen enough so they glow. And when they glow with a red light. Now, when we looked at the Orion Nebula, we saw around the edges some blue nebula. What looked blue, that's hydrogen too. It's the same thing. But the stars aren't close enough to excite the molecules to make them glow. But those molecules of hydrogen are receiving enough light so the light reflects off them, and you can see it because it's reflecting light, not because it's glowing. And so when it's reflecting light, it looks blue. So it's the same thing. Red is just where it's got enough energy, it's glowing, and blue is where it's reflecting. So we have emission nebulas where it's red, reflecting nebulas when it's blue, and when it's dark, it's called an absorption nebula because it's absorbing the light. If this red nebula weren't behind it, you wouldn't even see it at all, no matter what, because it's just blocking the darkness of space. But since it's floating in front of this, it kind of shows up and makes this beautiful little horse head you see right here. So it's one that's easy to photograph, not easy to see. I have a few friends who say they kind of think they saw it, and I don't know. I understand that there's some things you kind of think you see because you know it's there and you know what you're looking for, and it's a combination of maybe seeing it, and maybe a little wishful thinking too. But this is a very famous one, and it's also known as the Reaper's horse, the Grim Reaper's horse. And the joke you hear with astronomers is it's the Grim Reaper's horse, and you better hope you never see it, because if you see it, it means the Grim Reaper's on his way. Well, we all like scary stories, and that's kind of a fun one around that little nebula right there in Orion's belt, the Horsehead Nebula. But it is a really fun one to photograph. So those are some of the little secrets of the winter circle here. And a number of neat things to explore with the backyard telescope or your camera or just a pair of binoculars. Almost everything I showed you there, other than the horse head, you can see with a pair of binoculars to some extent, and you'll see it better with a telescope. So now let's just zoom around one time. And one more thing I want to show you, because everyone wants to see the Big Dipper. So let's finish up with that. Then we're going to talk about the eclipse for a few minutes. Look low in the northeastern sky, and you will find the 7 stars of the Big Dipper right here. The Big Dipper has 3 stars for a curved handle and 4 stars for the pot or the bowl. Put some lines on it, and you get the full lines of Ursa Major, the Great Bear, because remember earlier I said the Big Dipper is actually supposed to be a bear. Most people have a hard time seeing a bear even out of all those stars put together. Remember, everything inside this red boundary is part of Ursa Major, the Great Bear. You can draw it any way you want. You can draw a fancy looking bear with a long tail. You can draw a dot-to-dot bear. Or if you like most people, you just simplify it down to a cooking pot. Or some people come all the way back and add these two stars and make a frying pan. All over the world, people look at these seven stars and make pictures. We draw the dipper. In England, it's called the plow. This is the handle of the plow. The blade comes down like this, and this goes off to the horses this way to draw the plow through the earth. In Germany, it's known as the wagon. To the slaves of the South 150 years ago, this was the drinking gourd, which led their way north to freedom. So there's the Big Dipper. Go to the back two stars, the Big Dipper. They're called the pointer stars, Merrick and Doobie. You draw a line up through them, they'll point you to this star, which is Polaris, the North Star, better known as the North Star, and probably the most famous star in the sky, though not the brightest. Sirius is the brightest. The North Star is down around 48th brightest, and it marks the end of the handle of the very faint Little Dipper. Now, the Little Dipper is a good one to see what kind of skies you have. Now, I'm here in Greater Waterville, and in Greater Waterville, uh, these you can see Polaris just fine. You can see Kochub, the star here. These tend to get washed out if you're right in town. There's just too much light pollution where I am. So faint stars get washed out of your field of view. You just can't see them. If I get out in the countryside, they look kind of like they do here. We can see them here. This isn't a perfect sky. You guys up in Rangeley have much better skies than we have in the Waterville area. If it were clear tonight and we were at the touring center and we looked to the north, there's a good chance that on a clear night, the sky won't look like this. It will look more like this. A lot more stars. And it's very, very beautiful when the sky is like this. And you get that a lot in places like Rangeley or Katahdin Woods and Waters or the AMC properties or the Allagash and places like that. And you're lucky to be in a spot that has such beautiful, pristine skies because it's something really special to see. They're still there. One of the problems you have when the sky is that way is sometimes the constellations get hard to find just because there are so many stars in the sky. Well, that's our tour of the night sky, and I'd like to take the last, I guess we've got about 15 to 20 minutes, and talk about a celestial event that's going to be happening this spring, and it's going to be happening for you in Rangeley, and that is the solar eclipse. So I'm going to share the screen again, but we're going to go to my PowerPoint and get started here. Hold on. Right here, and let's just do play from the start. So the last time we had a total solar eclipse in Maine was on July 20th, 1963. And that year, Rangeley was just outside the path of totality. Now, this is a postcard that I'm involved with a blog called Postcards from Gus. And Gus is with a man named Augustus Phillips. And in the 1960s and early 70s, Gus was a cartographer and he made over 50 maps of Maine. He made some of the Rangeley area, some of the Moosehead area, the Allagash, different places along the coast, Penobscot Bay, several of Acadia National Park and Mount Desert Island, Casco Bay, and that sort of thing. And they're maps like this, the kind of one where you have like a little boat down in the corner or a moose over here or a canoeist or a fly fisherman and that sort of thing. Illustrative maps, the kind you'd put on the wall of a cabin, at the lake sort of thing. Well, he made this one of the eclipse in 1963 and made a postcard of it, and he sold 30,000 of them. And so we're doing a blog about Gus right now, and we just finished a blog about his experience with the eclipse. And I thought, boy, wouldn't it be cool to make that same thing today, but for this eclipse coming up? And I was able, since I'm involved with the family and the Penobscot Marine Museum, who has the rights to all this stuff now, it's all stored there. I've got the original map and made a new one from Gus's map and made one showing the path of the eclipse today. You see the path is a little bit wider this time around. It does vary in width depending on how far away the moon is and the size of the shadow, and there's a whole bunch of geometry that goes along with it. And the path is different. In 1963, it came down through here. And if you'd gone to Eustis, you would have been in the path. Rangeley, as you can see, was just outside of it. But this eclipse, if you're on centerline, only lasted about a minute. Our eclipse is going to happen here on April 8th. If you're on the center line, it's going to last 3 minutes and 28 seconds. If you're in Rangeley, you will be within the path of the eclipse. It won't last 3.5 minutes in Rangeley. It's probably going to last about a minute in Rangeley. And if you take the road up to Eustis, it's going to last longer. The closer you get to that center line, the longer it will last. So I encourage you to try to get within the center line. If you're outside, if you're down here, if you're in Bangor or Portland or Augusta or Waterville, of all places, you will see a partial eclipse. So let's learn the difference between a partial eclipse and a total eclipse and why you want to get to totality. Partial is cool, but totality is awesome. So we have partial eclipses much more often than we have total eclipses. This is one that happened just 3 years ago. On June 10th, 2021, at sunrise, we had a partial eclipse. I went to Cottonwoods and Waters up near Patton in Millinocket, and I took this picture of the partial eclipse that morning. When the sun rose, it was already partly eclipsed. So this is the sun, and the moon is partly covering it up. So we're not directly under the shadow, we're only partly under the shadow. And through the course of that, this is that same eclipse. I took a whole series of pictures and stitched them all together. And you see how the moon moves. As the sun came up, the moon was moving down this way, and the sun is coming up this way. And so the shadow moved across it. But it never totally covered it up for us here in Maine. Last fall, we had another partial eclipse. It didn't cover nearly as much, but you can see it took a little bite to it. And that was in October 14th, I believe, this past fall, just a couple months ago. We had a cloudy day with breaks in the sun, breaks through, so we got glimpses here and there. That's why the times are so irregular here. But you can see it didn't nearly take it over. The last total eclipse in North America happened on August 21st, 2017. And I went to a place called Glendale, Wyoming to witness that eclipse. And I have been teaching about eclipses for 40 years, since 1979 when I started teaching in the planetarium. And I've talked about them in and out and backwards, and I kind of understand the mechanics of what's going on fairly well. And I was all set up. I'm a photographer. I took all these pictures, and including this one. That's my wife there in my camera with the zoom. I had two cameras. This is the picture that camera took during totality. And during totality, when it's like this, you can look directly at it. You do not need eclipse glasses at this point. All the partial phases, you need your eclipse glasses. But when it's totality, if you look at that with eclipse glasses, you won't see anything. It won't show up. You can look at it. It's totally safe. And it's one of the most spectacular things you're ever going to see. So how do you get this? Well, it takes three things. It takes the sun, and it takes the moon, and it takes the earth. You need all three things. And what they have to do is that the three of them have to line up in a straight line, which astronomers would call syzygy. Syzygy is when things are aligned in a straight line. Sounds pretty simple. Part of the problem, though, is, we get these three pictures of the sun, the moon, and the earth, and they all look like they're exactly the same size. And as you probably know already, they are not the same size. Here is the sun, and here is the size of the earth compared to the sun, that little dot right down there. If the sun were hollow, you could put 1,200,000 Earths inside the sun. It is absolutely immense. It looks small to us because it's 93 million miles away. So the sun is huge compared to the Earth, and the Earth is pretty big compared to the moon. This is an actual photograph taken by one of the probes that was on the far side of the moon. And this is the back side of our moon, which looks different than the near side, as you can see. But that's our moon, and there's the Earth. You see Baja California right there in a storm off the coast. Maine would be up here, up in the corner here, somewhere under the clouds. Pretty typical, right? So the moon's a lot smaller than the Earth, and the Earth is a lot smaller than the sun. The amazing thing, though, is that the moon and the sun in the sky, to our eyes, looks to be exactly the same size. And this is because of an incredibly rare coincidence. And the coincidence is that the sun is 400 times bigger in diameter than the moon. So you could put 400 moons in a row across the face of the sun. So that's one fact. The other fact is that the sun is 400 times farther away from us than the moon is. And because it's 400 times bigger and 400 times farther away, that makes them have the exact same angular size in the sky. That's an amazing coincidence. Lots of planets have moons, and there's no other planet where they end up taking the exact same size. So that's one of the fascinating facts about an eclipse of the sun. This is the only planet where it happens on. So what happens during an eclipse? So if you want to look towards the sun, you need to have eclipse glasses because the sun will burn your eyes out. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Now that disc coming in there, that's the moon coming in. When it first touches the sun, you'll hear that referred to as first contact. There are four contacts. The first is when the moon first appears. Second contact is when the moon hits the other side and totally covers up the sun. And that's about to happen here. If any little bit's visible, you can't look at it. But as soon as it's covered up like this, like now, you can take your eclipse glasses off and stare right at it. And if you're at the center line, it's going to be covered up for 3 minutes and 28 seconds. If you're down in Rangeley, it'll be just a minute or so. Then it comes off. That's third contact. And when it first comes off, that bright flash of light will look incredibly bright, and you'll immediately have to look away and put your eclipse glasses back on. And then this whole process from third contact to fourth contact, or first to second, while it's partial phases, takes about an hour and 10 to 12 minutes. So it's going a little faster. And then when it finally disappears, that's fourth contact. I say that just because if you're around people watching the eclipse, they talk about, oh, it's first contact. And it's like, I've heard people, what does that mean? Well, now you know. So what's the mechanics are here is this is not to scale at all, but the shadow of the moon hits the earth. And this shadow, where it hits the earth right here, this little point, that shadow is about 170 miles in diameter. And it makes a circular shadow. Now, so to see the totality, you have to be inside that shadow. If you're outside here, where it's blue, that's where you're going to get a partial eclipse. If you're standing here, the moon's going to partly cover up the sun, but not cover up the whole thing. And if you're outside the shadow, let's say you're up here or down here, you're not going to see eclipse at all. It's just going to be a normal sunny day. So if you're in the shadow, that shadow is a round shadow. This is what it looks like from the space station. During an eclipse, they look down and there's an eclipse going on right here. That's the moon shadow. But the shadow doesn't just hit one spot on the earth, because remember, the earth is rotating. It rotates once a day, which means it's rotating at about 950 miles an hour. And the moon is moving. It's going around the earth. And the earth is also going around the sun. So you get all kinds of orbital mechanics going on here. And what that does is it makes the shadow move, and it moves from west to east. So on April 8th, the shadow is going to start in the Pacific Ocean, come across Mexico and Texas, and right across the central United States. And up here, it's going to go through Maine and New Brunswick, part of Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland, and then off into the Atlantic Ocean. That travels at about 1,500 miles an hour. No, 1,200 miles an hour, I believe. Pretty fast as it moves across. That's why, as that shadow, 170 miles in diameter, only takes 3 minutes to go across wherever you happen to be if you're on the center line. So if you want to see this eclipse and you're not in Maine, but you're in Texas, you'll see it in Texas. Now, you may have heard that lots of people are coming to this eclipse. Well, there will be lots of people, especially if it's a clear day. And what will happen is, if it's a clear day, you can have a lot of people, because local people in Maine will come north. People in Boston, it's a beautiful day. Oh, there's an eclipse. Where are we going to go see it? And you go to Burlington, Vermont, perhaps. But from Boston, it's easier to come to Maine than Vermont. So they're going to come up to Maine and go to Jackman or Rangeley or Sugarloaf or Millinocket or Holton or Greenville or someplace like that. If you're a serious eclipse watcher and you live in Boston, you're going to Texas. The reason you go to Texas is because statistically it's clear in Texas a lot more than it is in Maine. In Maine, it's overcast 65% of the time. In Texas, it's like 20%. So you're much more likely to see it in Texas. And the other advantage to Texas is it's going to last 4.5 minutes in Texas. It's going to last a little longer than it does here. Well, I'm going to be in Maine. I'm going to be in Jackman, Maine, because Jackman's right on center line. And I encourage you to get somewhere within that. Here's how it's going to travel through Maine. This is the path for this April, like we saw on the postcard earlier. You see Rangeley is well within the path of totality. Jackman, where I'm going to be, is going to be pretty much right on center line. And just north of Holton will be too. And Holton's planning a really big celebration, and they're doing all kinds of special things all weekend long. The eclipse is happening on a Monday afternoon at 3:30 in the afternoon. And I suggest wherever you go, if you can stay there that night, stay there. In 2017, we had to leave Glendo after the eclipse, and the eclipse was over at 1:30 in the afternoon. We thought plenty of time to get back to Denver to fly out early the next morning. It's about a 2-hour drive from there to Denver. on normal days. It took us 9 hours to get to our friend's house, which was an hour north of Denver. So, because there was bumper to bumper traffic and everyone wanted to leave at the same time. And there were thousands of people there. So it's better to stay off the roads if you don't want to get frustrated. If you missed that one, the next eclipse in Maine will be on May 1st, 2079. It's going to go right up the coast. It's going to miss Rangeley altogether. But if you're anywhere on the coast of Maine, you're going to get totality. You're not on center line. If you want to go to center line, you've got to go to Nova Scotia or Newfoundland, and then you'll have it last a little bit longer. There are other eclipses too that go through the United States. These are all the ones for the 21st century. And I don't know, 2079 doesn't look good for me. I'll be 120 years old, but if I can make it, I'll be there, and I'll see you there for that one. So let's talk about eye safety, because that's what everyone's concerned about. You know, what happens when you look at an eclipse? Why is it bad for your eyes? Well, you should never look at the sun. So don't worry about the eclipse. Just think about the sun. The sun, we all glance at the sun, and you glance at the sun for just a second and it hurts. So you squint, you look away, and then you see spots for a little while. I always tell kids, do you know what those spots are? And that's your eyes' way of saying, hey, cut it out. That hurts. Because what happens is you've got a lens on the front of your eye right here, just like a magnifying glass. Focuses the image on the back of your eye, your retina. Well, the sunlight's so bright, it focuses it. It's like focusing a magnifying glass where you try to set a leaf or something on fire when you're a kid. Well, here you're focusing that light on the back, and it'll actually burn your retina and permanently damage your eyes. Now, an eclipse is no more dangerous than the sun on any sunny day. You go out any sunny day and stare at the sun for 10 seconds, and you'll permanently damage your eyes. We don't worry about you doing that, and we don't worry about kids doing that, because you look at the sun, it hurts, you look away, and you see spots, and that's annoying, so you don't do it again. The problem with an eclipse is something interesting is happening, and you want to look at it. But you don't want to damage your eyes. So buy a pair of eclipse glasses like these. They're made of paper, and then there's this mylar filter here, or there's several different types of filters, but the only thing you can see through these is the sun. You won't see anything else. You won't see your friends. You won't see anything. It's designed to cut out 99.99% of the light, to take it down to the point where it will no longer damage your eyes or burn your retina, and you can see great detail in the sun. You can use it anytime to look at the sun. You can see sunspots and other interesting things. It costs about $2 a pair. And you put them on, you can sit back in your chair and enjoy the eclipse. It was the eclipse in 2017. And we all had our eclipse glasses, and were able to observe the sun directly. If you have a telescope and you want to look at an eclipse, you need to have a solar filter, and the filter has to go in front of the telescope, not back by the eyepiece, to make it safe. Because if you put a filter in your eyepiece to darken it down, the way it does that is by absorbing the light. And when you absorb the light, it turns it into heat. And the heat can get so hot, it'll crack the lens. And when it cracks the lens, you've taken a lot of light and condensed it down, and it makes it even brighter than just looking at the sun, and it can damage your a fraction of a second. So you can look at through a telescope, but you need a proper solar filter over the front of the telescope, not back by the eyepiece. Another way, if you don't buy a pair of eclipse glasses, and by the way, those eclipse glasses are like $2 a pair if you buy them now. If you wait to the eclipse day and someone's selling them, they're going to be like $20 a pair, because people want them at that point and they don't have them, and people can get whatever they want for them. Another way to safely do it is you take a box like this and you cut a hole in the side, and you put your back to the sun. So the sun's behind you. And at the top end, you see this duct tape wrapped around here. And the way it works is up here at the top end, you duct tape or you tape a piece of aluminum foil over a hole in the box. Then you just put a little pinhole in the aluminum foil, and it makes a little tiny spot of light that comes through that hole, and it shines down on the other end of the box. And you put a little piece of paper in there, tape it in, white paper, and you'll get an image of the sun. And as the eclipse takes place, you'll see that round disc will have a bite taken out of it. It's actually a picture of the sun. And you look at that picture. You don't look up through the hole. The sun's always at your back. And that's a safe way to do it. The longer the box is, the bigger the image of the sun will be. So you can see this lady has a very long box because the pinhole's way up there. So she's going to get a bigger image than this young woman who has a shorter box, or this kid who has one right here. but they all will make a nice image of the sun, and you can watch the eclipse safely that way. And it's a fun project with kids for everyone to make their own box. Another way is look at the shadows under trees. So here we're looking through at the shadow of the sunlight shining through a tree, and you notice that all the shadows make little arcs. Well, that's where the eclipse was. It was almost total at this point, not quite, and making those are little tiny pictures of the sun, every single one of them. It's doing the same thing that box does, is a pinhole projection. And so you get to see the sun that way safely by not looking directly at the sun. Now, during totality, you can turn around and just stare at the sun, and it is incredibly beautiful. What you're seeing here is the sun's corona, the outer atmosphere. The disk of the sun, where the sunlight is actually coming from, the part that will damage your eyes, is totally behind the sun. And the corona is the outer atmosphere, and the sunlight shining off to the left and right and sideways, not at us directly. And every eclipse is unique in the way that the corona looks, because the corona has gases flowing through it and plasma flowing through it. So it's changing in shape, and it's very dynamic. You won't see it changing when you look at it. But if you look at one eclipse and you come and see another eclipse a few years later, the pattern is going to be totally different. And you see different things. So here you can see these little orange spots. Those are solar prominences. Prominences are eruptions of hot gases that follow the magnetic lines of the sun. Now, when you look with your eyes, you can see these, and you'll see this at the same time. You get a hint of it here in this photograph. When you take a picture, this is where your eyes are better. When we looked at the nebulas, we seemed like the camera was better than our eyes. Here, your eyes are better than the camera. You can see it all at the same time. Here, the camera sees the corona, and that washes out the prominences, which aren't as bright, which are brighter actually, and the corona is fainter, so you have to expose it longer to make the corona show up. And if you expose it so you can see the prominences, the corona is not bright enough to even show up. So you take different pictures to see different aspects, which your eyes can see all at the same time. When the sun reappears, this is when you need to get your eclipse glasses back on. You can see how bright it is here. And this is called the diamond ring effect, and it only lasts for a second. What happens is the first place it shows up is through a valley between, because the moon has mountains and things, and it shows up through this valley, and so it shows up as a very intense small point of light, and it makes the whole thing look like a diamond ring, a bright diamond, and then you see the ring of the glow around the surface of the moon. Photographers always like to try to capture this. There are much better pictures than my picture. This is the one I took in 2017, hoping to get a better one this April. It always happens, and everyone's always scurrying to put their eclipse glasses back on because it's incredibly bright. Other things to do during the eclipse is just look around. This is at Glendo in 2017. This is before the eclipse started, and the next picture is about 2/3 the way through the partial phases towards totality, and you see how much darker it was getting. So as the eclipse happens, it gets darker and darker, but it's not like twilight because it's got a different feel to it. The shadows get sharper because the sun's getting smaller in angular size, and that makes the shadows be much sharper and cleaner looking, and it gives an eerie, steely light. It's a little disconcerting, but it's a fascinating thing to experience. And once you're in totality, you can see a few of the bright stars. It's not like being out at night. It's not going to be pitch black, but you do see a few of the bright stars around the sun. This year, we might see the planet Jupiter and a few other cool things like that. And you'll notice birds stop calling and things quiet down. The temperature cools off. A lot of things to observe during the eclipse. And those things will happen regardless of whether it's clear or not. It's still going to get darker. So that's just a few things to think about with the upcoming eclipse. I hope you all find a place to see that eclipse safely and get within the path of totality. I had a friend tell me before 2017 that the difference between seeing a partial eclipse and a total eclipse, a partial eclipse is like seeing a lightning bug, pretty cool. A total eclipse is like seeing a bolt of lightning, much more dramatic. And so you really want to get in that path. And the Rangeley Lakes regions will be within that path. So if you're in Rangeley, you're lucky. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to find a hotel. You can just go outside your house if it's clear. Knock on wood, it'll be clear, and see an amazing celestial event. And the next one won't be till 2079 here in the state of Maine.